Dad, I think I hurt someone.
Daniel, listen to me. Stay exactly where you are. Don't call anyone else. I'm coming. Please, just let him be alive.
I didn't see her. I swear I didn't see her.
And go home.
What?
Go, right now.
Sir, were you driving this vehicle?
Yes,
You're saying no one else was here?
that's right.
Dad, let me tell them the truth.
No,
I can't keep living like this.
that's exactly why you have to. Just one last promise. I prayed you'd never have to read this. Read it after I'm gone.
Dad, what is this?
Everything I never told you.
Walter Briggs?
I've been waiting for you,
Why didn't you run?
because I already went where I needed to go. Daniel, if you're reading this, then I couldn't protect this secret anymore.
In the next 12 hours,
No.
a dying man walked past 3 police cars, a gas station clerk, and a highway patrol officer, and not one of them stopped him. He wasn't hiding. He wanted to be found, just not yet. Somewhere behind a house that no longer belonged to him, an old pocket watch sat half buried in the dirt, its glass face cracked, its hands frozen at a time that meant something only to him. By the end of this story, you'll understand why a man serving a life sentence chose freedom for exactly 14 hours, and why what he did with them changed everything. His name was Walter Briggs, inmate number 4471, 20 years into a 25 to life sentence. And for reasons no one in that patrol car would understand until much later, he had already decided he wasn't running from anyone at all. To understand why a 61-year-old man with weeks left to live would risk everything to walk out of a hospital hallway unguarded, you have to understand 3 things. First, who Walter Briggs actually was before any of this happened, what took place on a stretch of county road 20 years ago that put him behind bars in the first place, and who was waiting for him on the other side of that decision, someone he hadn't spoken to face in almost 4 years. Because this isn't really a story about an escape. It's a story about a promise made in the dark, on the worst night of 2 men's lives, and what it costs a father to keep that promise for 2 decades without ever once explaining why. Walter Briggs was not the kind of man anyone expected to end up in a place like this. He served 8 years in the Marine Corps before coming home to a small town in the Midwest, the kind of place where people knew each other's trucks by the sound of the engine before they ever saw the driver's face. He opened a small auto repair shop on the edge of town, the kind with a hand-painted sign and a coffee pot that never stopped running, and within a few years he had built a reputation as the man you called when nobody else could figure out what was wrong. He wasn't flashy, he wasn't loud. Neighbors would later describe him as steady, the sort of man who showed up early, stayed late, fixed things quietly, and never once asked for credit. He raised his son alone. Daniel Briggs was 7 years old when his mother died, and from that point forward it was just the 2 of them in a small house with a gravel driveway, learning how to be a family without any kind of blueprint to follow. Walter worked long days at the shop and still came home to cook dinner, check homework, and coach a little league team that, by every account, he was not particularly good at coaching. People who knew them back then describe a father and son who were closer than most, who spent Saturday mornings fishing at a lake 20 minutes outside of town, who had built, over the course of a decade, an entire private language of inside jokes that belonged only to the 2 of them. By the time Daniel turned 19, he was caught somewhere between the boy his father had raised and the man he hadn't quite become yet. He had lost his mother young, and grief has a strange way of resurfacing years later, dressed up as recklessness instead of sadness. Friends from that time remember a kid who was mostly fine, mostly steady, until certain nights when something underneath the surface came loose without warning. Nobody thought much of it. 19-year-olds go through things. What nobody could have predicted was that one particular night, a night that began like any other, was about to become the night that defined the next 20 years of both of their lives, and neither of them would ever be the same after it. It started with a phone call. Just past midnight, on a night in late autumn, Walter's phone rang, and on the other end was his son's voice, shaking in a way he had never once heard before. Walter would later describe, in the only interview he ever agreed to give, that he knew something had gone badly wrong before Daniel had even finished a single sentence. He grabbed his keys. He didn't ask questions over the phone. He said only the words that would end up shaping the rest of his life. Stay where you are. Don't call anyone else. I'm coming. What Walter found when he arrived at that stretch of county road 20 minutes later is something we're going to walk through carefully, because the story that made it into the courtroom and the story that actually happened that night were never quite the same story at all. 20 minutes is not a long drive, but for a father racing through the dark with no idea what he's about to find, it can feel like the longest stretch of road in the world. Walter would later say he doesn't remember most of that drive. He remembers gripping the wheel too tightly. He remembers the radio playing something he couldn't identify and never turned off. He remembers most of all praying in a way he hadn't prayed since his wife's funeral, 12 years earlier, asking for something he couldn't even name yet, because he still didn't know what he was driving toward. All he knew was his son's voice on the phone and a silence underneath that voice that told him this was not a fender bender, not a flat tire, not anything ordinary at all. Before we go any further, and before we tell you exactly what Walter found on that road, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We always love hearing that. And if you haven't already, now is the moment to hit subscribe, because what happens in the next few minutes of this story is the part almost nobody outside that small town ever learned the full truth about. And once you hear it, you will understand exactly why Walter Briggs was willing to give up the next 20 years of his life without ever explaining himself to a single soul. On that road was a woman named Emily Carter, 26 years old, a school teacher on her way home from a late shift at a diner she worked to help pay down student loans. She taught second grade at the elementary school on the north side of town, the kind of teacher students remembered for years afterward, the kind who kept a drawer of granola bars for kids who came to class hungry. She had grown up 2 towns over, moved to Walter and Daniel's town for the teaching job, and was, by every account from people who knew her, exactly the kind of person this community was proud to call one of its own. She would not survive that night, and in the minutes before police arrived at the scene, Walter Briggs made a decision in the dark that would cost him the next 2 decades of his life. When Walter pulled up to that stretch of road, his headlights caught his son first, standing at the edge of the pavement, frozen, staring at something Walter couldn't yet see clearly. Daniel had been driving home from a party, and somewhere along that dark curve, in a moment that would take less than 2 seconds and unravel 2 families forever, his car struck Emily Carter as she walked along the shoulder toward her apartment, less than half a mile away. Daniel had not been drinking that night. He would insist on this fact for the next 20 years, to anyone who asked, and the physical evidence, when it was finally tested, would eventually back him up. What he had been was distracted, reaching for a phone that had slid off the passenger seat, gone for a moment that should have meant nothing, and instead meant everything. Walter got out of his truck and walked toward his son without saying a single word. He is described, in that one interview, standing over the scene and feeling something in him go completely still, the way a man's mind sometimes goes quiet right before it makes the decision that will define the rest of his life. Daniel was 19 years old. He had his entire future in front of him. A scholarship to a state college he was set to start the following fall. A whole life that had not yet had the chance to happen. Walter was 41. He had already lived the first half of his life. And somewhere in the space of maybe 90 seconds, standing on that dark road with sirens beginning to sound faintly in the distance, Walter Briggs made the choice that would put him behind bars for the next 20 years of his life. He told Daniel to get back in his own car and drive home, to tell no one, to say nothing to anyone, ever, about what had happened on that road. And then Walter Briggs got behind the wheel of his son's car and waited for the police to arrive. When officers reached the scene minutes later, they found a man standing beside a damaged vehicle, next to a woman who could not be saved, and Walter Briggs told them, without hesitation, that he had been the
Sir,
one
were you
driving.
driving this vehicle?
There were no other witnesses. There was no security camera on that stretch of road. There was only a father's fingerprints on a steering wheel that had belonged, for those crucial minutes, to no one but him, and a story that would hold up in court well enough to end his freedom for the next 2 decades of his life. The trial moved quickly, faster than most cases of its kind, in part because Walter never contested a single detail of the account he had given that night. He pleaded guilty. He declined to testify further. He asked his court-appointed attorney, more than once, not to pursue any line of defense that might complicate the story he had already told. Prosecutors would later admit, long after the fact, that something about the case never quite sat right with them, a nagging sense that the pieces fit together too cleanly, that a man with Walter's spotless record didn't match the profile of someone who would leave the scene of an accident he'd actually caused. But without evidence to contradict his own sworn confession, there was nothing more for anyone to investigate. Walter Briggs was sentenced to 25 years to life for manslaughter, and he never once, in the 2 decades that followed, said another word to explain why. Daniel visited his father in prison every month for the first 3 years, sitting across from him in a visitation room that smelled like bleach and old coffee, both of them carrying a silence neither one knew how to break. Over time, the visits became less frequent, not because Daniel stopped caring, but because every single one of them left him unable to sleep for days afterward, haunted by a debt he had no idea how to repay, and a father who refused to let him try. Walter built a quiet, disciplined life inside those walls. He worked in the prison's auto shop, teaching other inmates the same skills he'd once taught apprentices back home. He kept no enemies. He broke no rules. Correctional officers who worked that unit for years would later describe him as one of the easiest men they ever had to manage, a man who seemed, somehow, at peace with a sentence that made no sense to anyone who actually knew him. 17 years into his sentence, Walter was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, the kind that gives a man months rather than years, sometimes only weeks. He filed for compassionate release, a legal process that allows terminally ill inmates to spend their final days outside prison walls under specific conditions, and for a while, it looked as though the request might actually succeed. Then, without explanation that was ever made fully public, the request stalled in a review process that dragged on for the better part of a year, caught in paperwork and bureaucratic delay, while Walter's condition steadily worsened. By the time doctors were giving him weeks rather than months, the compassionate release petition still had not been approved, and Walter Briggs, for the first time in 20 years, began quietly making plans of his own. Now we arrive back at the moment where this story began. A routine transport, from the prison medical unit to a hospital 40 minutes away, for a scan doctors needed before adjusting his pain management. 2 correctional officers, a transport van, and a man everyone involved considered one of the lowest security risks in the entire facility. Somewhere between the hospital's imaging department and the transport van waiting outside, in a gap of less than 4 minutes while one officer stepped away to move the vehicle, Walter Briggs simply walked out through a side exit and did not come back. There was no violence. There was no struggle. There was, according to hospital surveillance footage reviewed afterward, a 61-year-old man in a wheelchair who stood up, walked calmly down a hallway, and disappeared into a parking structure, as though he had somewhere very specific to be. Within the hour, the state had issued an alert. Corrections officials described Walter as non-violent, but urged the public not to approach him. Standard protocol for any escape, regardless of an inmate's history. Local news picked up the story almost immediately, running his 20-year-old booking photo alongside a current photo taken during his last medical evaluation, the 2 images barely resembling the same person. Reporters speculated about motive within hours of the alert going out. Some assumed a man facing death behind bars had simply decided to spend whatever time he had left as a free man, however briefly, however illegally. Others assumed he was headed toward family, toward an old accomplice, toward anywhere that might offer a final stretch of freedom before his condition caught up with him for good. What almost no one considered in those first frantic hours of the search was that Walter Briggs already knew exactly how his story was going to end, and that ending had absolutely nothing to do with escaping justice at all. Law enforcement treated the search with more urgency than the situation, on paper, seemed to warrant. K-9 units were deployed along the highway corridor near the hospital. A tip line lit up with sightings from 3 different counties within the first 6 hours. Most of them, as is typical in cases like this, leading nowhere. One promising lead placed a man matching Walter's description near a bus station close to the state line, prompting officers to widen the search radius and alert transit authorities 2 states over, under the theory that a dying man might be trying to get as far from custody as possible before anyone caught up to him. It would take investigators most of the day to realize that Walter Briggs was not moving away from anything. He was moving directly towards something, and he had been the entire time. While patrol units chased a lead 200 miles in the wrong direction, Walter was walking, on foot, along familiar back roads toward the town where he had spent the first 41 years of his life. Surveillance footage recovered days later showed him passing within sight of 2 different patrol cars during those early hours, neither officer giving him a second glance, because nothing about a tired-looking older man walking along a rural roadside matched the urgency of the alert circulating on their radios. He stopped briefly at a gas station just after sunrise, and the young woman working the counter that morning would later tell reporters she recognized him immediately, not from any wanted poster, but from a memory nearly 20 years old, of a mechanic who had once fixed her father's truck for free during a winter her family couldn't afford the repair. She said nothing to anyone that day. She simply let him buy a bottle of water and walked back inside. By early afternoon, Walter had reached the edge of his old property, a house he hadn't set foot on in 2 decades, sold off years earlier to cover legal costs, and now owned by a family who had no idea what history the land underneath their back fence actually held. He waited until the house appeared empty, then walked to a specific corner of the yard, near an old fence post that had somehow survived 20 years of weather and new ownership, and began to dig. What he pulled out of the ground that afternoon was a small metal tin, rusted at the edges, that he had buried there himself on the very night everything went wrong, before police had even arrived at the scene down the road. Inside that tin was a single folded letter, written in his own handwriting, dated the night of the accident, that he had never shown to another living person in 20 years. We are not going to tell you what was written on that letter just yet, because in order to understand exactly why it mattered so much, and exactly why Walter Briggs risked his final weeks of freedom to retrieve it, you need to understand what happened next, in the 14 hours that followed, and why a dying man who could have run in any direction he wanted instead chose to walk, calmly and without hesitation, directly toward the one place he knew law enforcement would eventually find him. Before we tell you what happened next, we want to pause here, because this is the part of the story where everything changes, and we don't want you to miss a single detail of it. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't a simple story about an escape. It's a story about what one man was willing to carry, silently, for 20 years, and what finally made him decide to put it down. So before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because what you're about to hear next is the part of this story that changes everything you think you already understand about Walter Briggs. With the tin box in hand, Walter did not run and did not hide. He walked into town, past a hardware store that had replaced the one he remembered, past a diner that still had the same sign from 20 years earlier, and made his way to a small house on the east side of town where his son now lived with a wife and a daughter Walter had never once met in person. Daniel was 39 years old by then, a man who had built a quiet, careful life for himself, working as an electrician, raising a 7-year-old girl who had no idea her grandfather existed anywhere outside of old photographs her father kept in a drawer he rarely opened. Walter did not go to the front door. He waited across the street, in the shade of a tree, until he saw his son's car pull into the driveway that evening, and only then did he step forward into the light. What passed between Walter and Daniel on that porch that evening, according to the only account either man has ever given, lasted less than 10 minutes, and neither man has ever repeated, word for word, exactly what was said. What we do know is that Walter handed his son the small tin box, told him to read what was inside it once he had gone, and asked him to make sure his granddaughter knew, someday, that her grandfather had loved her before he had ever even met her. Then Walter turned and walked back down the driveway, toward the small park at the edge of the neighborhood, where he sat down on a bench beneath a street lamp and waited, because he had already decided, long before that evening, exactly how this particular chapter of his life was going to end. Police found him there less than 2 hours later, sitting calmly on that bench, hands resting on his knees, making no attempt whatsoever to run or resist. The officers who arrested him that night would later describe the moment as one of the strangest of their careers, expecting confrontation and instead finding a man who greeted them by name, having recognized one of the deputies from his own trial 2 decades earlier, and who asked only for a few minutes to finish the water bottle he was holding before they placed him back in cuffs. Walter Briggs's 14 hours of freedom were over, but what he had done with those 14 hours, and what was now sitting in his son's hands 2 miles away, was about to unravel a story that had held together, without a single crack, for 20 years. Daniel did not open that tin box until well after midnight, long after his daughter had gone to sleep and his wife had asked him, more than once, what was wrong. When he finally unfolded the letter inside, written in his father's handwriting, and dated the night of the accident, he found not a confession of guilt, but a confession of love, disguised as an explanation Walter had never intended anyone to read unless something happened to him first. The letter explained, in plain and unflinching language, exactly what Walter had done on that road 20 years earlier, and exactly why. It stated clearly that Daniel had been driving that night, that the accident had been just that, an accident, without alcohol or recklessness involved, and that Walter had made the decision, in the space of 90 seconds, to take his son's place, because he could not bear the thought of a 19-year-old boy losing his entire future over 2 seconds he could never take back. Daniel read that letter 4 times before he was able to move from the kitchen table where he sat with it. 20 years of guilt he had never fully understood the shape of suddenly had a name, a date, and a father's handwriting attached to it. He had always known, somewhere beneath the surface, that something about that night didn't add up, that his father's silence in the years since carried a weight that didn't match the story everyone else believed. But knowing it in the quiet corners of his own mind and holding physical proof of it in his hands were 2 entirely different things, and by sunrise, Daniel Briggs had made a decision of his own, one that would take the story of Walter Briggs public in a way neither of them could have predicted 20 years earlier on that dark road. Daniel went to the district attorney's office the following morning, letter in hand, and told them everything. He did not wait to be asked. He did not consult a lawyer first. He simply walked in and told the truth his father had spent 20 years protecting him from ever having to tell. The letter, combined with modern forensic techniques that hadn't existed at the time of the original trial, was enough to reopen the case entirely. Reanalysis of physical evidence from the accident scene, preserved for 2 decades in state evidence storage, confirmed details that matched Daniel's account far more closely than the account Walter had given at trial. Details about the vehicle's speed, its point of impact, and the position of the driver's seat that no defense attorney had ever thought to challenge 20 years earlier, because no one had ever had a reason to doubt Walter's own sworn confession. Once the story became public, it moved through local and then national news with a speed that surprised even the reporters covering it. A father who had spent 20 years in prison, silently protecting his teenage son. A son who had spent 20 years unknowingly living a life his father had sacrificed everything to give him. And a granddaughter who was, for the first time, learning that the grandfather she had never met was, according to nearly everyone weighing in online and on air, one of the most selfless men most people had ever heard of. Public sentiment shifted almost overnight. The same headlines that had described Walter Briggs as a dangerous escapee just days earlier now described him as a father who had given up 2 decades of his life to protect his son, and the pressure on the state to revisit his compassionate release petition became, within days, impossible for officials to ignore. The legal process that followed moved with a speed rarely seen in cases like this, driven by new evidence, an outpouring of public support, and a medical prognosis that gave everyone involved a clear and urgent deadline. Attorneys who had followed the case for years, including some who had quietly doubted the original conviction from the beginning, stepped forward to assist Daniel and Walter's legal team without charge. A judge who reviewed the new evidence granted an expedited hearing within 2 weeks, an almost unheard-of timeline for a case of this complexity. Walter, weakened considerably by both his illness and the physical toll of his time on the run, appeared at that hearing in a wheelchair, his son seated directly behind him in the courtroom, for the first time in years, close enough to reach out and place a hand on his father's shoulder throughout the proceedings. The judge's ruling, when it finally came, granted Walter Briggs immediate compassionate release, citing both his terminal diagnosis and what the ruling itself described as compelling evidence that the original conviction had rested on a confession given, in the judge's own words, under circumstances that called its voluntariness seriously into question. Walter Briggs walked out of that courthouse a free man for the first time in 20 years, into a parking lot filled with reporters, cameras, and standing quietly near the back of the crowd, a granddaughter he was finally able to meet in person for the very first time. He knelt down slowly, with some difficulty, and introduced himself to her the way any grandfather might, as though the 20 years in the courtroom and the entire complicated history between them had simply fallen away in that one ordinary, quiet moment. Walter Briggs spent his final 11 days as a free man in his son's home, in a small guest room that Daniel had spent the previous 2 weeks quietly preparing, filling it with photographs from years Walter had missed, and a window that looked out over the same kind of quiet street he remembered from his own childhood. He met his granddaughter properly during those 11 days, learned her favorite cartoons, listened to her read to him from a school book she was working through, and spent long afternoons on the back porch with Daniel, finally having the kinds of conversations 20 years of prison visitation rooms had never allowed either of them the privacy or the time to have. Neighbors who caught glimpses of him during those final days described a man who seemed, despite everything, entirely at peace, spending his last free hours exactly the way he had always wanted to spend them, quietly, with his family, asking for nothing more than that. Walter Briggs passed away 11 days after his release, at home, with Daniel and his granddaughter beside him. He never spoke publicly about his 20 years in prison, beyond the single interview he gave in his final week, in which he was asked, more than once, whether he had any regrets about the choice he made on that road 2 decades earlier. He said only that he would make the same choice again, without hesitation, and that the 20 years he lost were never really lost at all, because his son had gone on to build the exact kind of life Walter had always hoped for him, a life with a family, a home, and a daughter of his own who would grow up knowing, unlike Daniel had for so many years, exactly how far a father's love is capable of reaching. The story of Walter Briggs raises questions that don't have easy answers, the kind of questions that tend to stay with people long after a story like this one ends. Was justice actually served, 20 years too late, for a mistake that was never really Walter's to answer for in the first place? What does it cost a family to protect one another through silence rather than truth? And is that kind of silence its own form of love, or its own form of harm, carried quietly for 2 decades by 2 men who never had the chance to grieve it together until it was almost too late? If someone you loved made the choice Walter made that night, took on 20 years of your worst mistake so that you would never have to carry it yourself, would you have let them? Would you have even known, until it was far too late to stop them? Before we let you go tonight, tell us in the comments what you would have done in Walter's position, standing on that road in the dark with your son beside you, and only 90 seconds to decide. And if this story stayed with you the way we suspect it did, wait until you hear about the woman who spent 30 years raising another family's child, only to discover the truth on the very day of her daughter's wedding. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, because we have a lot more stories like this one still coming, and you will not want to miss what happens next.